This is from Samyutta Nikaya 56:30 with Gavampati. At one time, several bhikkhus were staying in the land of the Chettis at Sahajati. Now, at that time, after the meal, on return from alms round, several senior bhikkhus sat together in the pavilion, and this discussion came up among them. Friends, does someone who sees suffering also see the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering? When they said this, Venerable Gavampati said to those senior bhikkhus, Friends, I have heard and learned this in the presence of the Buddha. Someone who sees suffering also sees the origin of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. Someone who sees the origin of suffering also sees suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. Someone who sees the cessation of suffering also sees suffering, the origin of suffering, and the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering. Someone who sees the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering also sees suffering, the origin of suffering, and the cessation of suffering.
So it's not something that's commonly known, is it? Because usually there's a sort of we naturally begin with this assumption that we all know what suffering is, kind of thing. Or maybe some people also assume they already know the practice that leads to the cessation of suffering, but they haven't experienced the cessation for themselves or something like that. So like, after a period of doing the practice, you get this experience where you see the other truths that you didn't see before. But it's actually more, these things are so inextricably tied together that if you see one, you automatically see the other one. So first off, with suffering, like it doesn't define it there, but you see it in other places in the suttas. It defines it as basically any kind of displeasure out of it says not getting what you want, getting what you don't want, birth, aging, death, sickness, and finally it says, in short, the 5 assumed aggregates are suffering. So you can, to some extent, know, like everybody experiences aging, everybody experiences loss, everybody experiences these things, but seeing suffering to the full extent, meaning seeing the 5 assumed aggregates as sort of a phenomenon, that's already quite an achievement that would put you in the same position where you're able to see all the other ones as well. So, I think we discussed that in one of the previous talks where we said that there's a quote-unquote right type of suffering, or suffering that you shouldn't be trying to get rid of just out of habit, because it's we basically start with the default assumption that unpleasant feeling is what suffering is. Like, just as a result of that, then anything that manages or ameliorates your unpleasant feelings might seem like it's an escape from suffering. But that's because like the definition of what you're taking as suffering is already quite limited. So you can already see how that's a good example of how these things are tied together. So in the case of craving, I haven't clarified that if suffering is not unpleasant feeling, then what would craving be?
Yeah, so what is the standard definition of the origin of suffering, right? Which is Tanha, which appears in the suttas quite frequently. What does the Buddha say about that? well, from what I remember, it talks about, right, craving for sensuality, craving for being or existence, and also craving for non-being or non-existence.
Mm.
That is the, let's say, standard definition by the Buddha of what is craving.
Right, those are the examples of what craving is, but,
Mm.
but practically speaking, what is the how would you define experientially what craving is? Because usually you read the suttas and it makes sense to everyone to some extent, like what craving is, but as it says there, if you haven't seen the cessation merely on account of knowing what craving is, that means you still haven't fully understood what craving is.
So what I was thinking was, you were talking about negative feeling not being what suffering is. So in that kind of approaching it from that angle, I would say craving is kind of what creates friction with negative feeling, you could say. Craving is what kind of de facto turns negative feeling into suffering, I guess you could say. It's what makes it seem like suffering.
And is it just in relation to negative feeling?
Well, no. It would be in relation to the others, though.
So
I run the risk of walking into the same trap that Samiti in the suttas walked into. Because I was going to say, even when there is the pleasant feeling, the craving will still be in relation to a negative feeling, but that seems a bit dubious. Kind of a more general negative feeling of like the undercutting like anxiety of like, oh, I feel good now, but the anxiety of, will I be able to kind of maintain this? Will I stay this way?
Yeah, so even when there's pleasant feeling, there can still be the recognition that that's impermanent. It's not going to last, and even though that pleasant feeling endures, you still suffer on account of it not being permanent. Which means that there is still suffering even in the presence of pleasant feeling. So then the goal of the practice is not to artificially or through effort bring about pleasant feeling, but rather to know and to learn how to dwell disconnected from all feeling, including the pleasurable ones.
Yeah, because as it says, it's the 5 assumed aggregates in general that are suffering. And it doesn't matter whether that setup happens to be a pleasant setup. It's the fact that it's the 5 aggregates. The fact that even when you tell yourself, you might sort of develop the attitude that it's not yours, but fundamentally, unless you're an arahant, there is ownership there. So you can't just deny it through a view. It's you have to actually go the opposite direction and acknowledge that for as long as these things are there, you're liable to suffering. For as long as the 5 aggregates are assumed, which is the starting position. You don't have like a on and off switch where sometimes you have like the purified 5 aggregates and sometimes not. So yeah, from that point of view, you could say that again, that's not necessarily something that's very profound or deep. It almost every Buddhist would say, yes, I understand that craving is suffering, but the trick lies there in basically whatever you take from the suttas, it's always going to be an interpretation, but what makes you really understand the Four Noble Truths is not when you have the same information that the suttas describe, because anybody can have that. It's when that interpretation that you have aligns with what the interpretation of the Buddha had.
In other words, that your understanding of suffering is actually the suffering the Buddha talks about fully and completely.
Yeah, exactly. So
for each and every noble truth, basically.
That's why it's it shouldn't be, practice shouldn't be done with the assumption that yes, okay, I already understood these things. Now it's time to just do them, and then I'll get to this result. Actually, it's by refining, revising, and correcting your interpretation of what craving even is, for example, that you would arrive at stream entry, and get to see the Four Noble Truths. So not like I operate with the definition that I already have, not question it, and then I just do this practice on top of it, because that's really just operating kind of within the same understanding, within the same, even if you get some result out of it, you haven't like left the wrong view that you started with. So that's why the Buddha said there is wrong view, i.e. not understanding the Four Noble Truths, that results in wrong intention, that results in wrong speech, that results in wrong action, and it goes all the way even to wrong liberation. In other words, you can liberate yourself from a limited, ultimately inaccurate craving, because your understanding of what craving was inaccurate from the beginning, and you cannot, when it comes to craving, as the Buddha said, like defilements cannot be abandoned without knowing and seeing what those defilements are first. He said if you don't see craving clearly, it's not like you can expect that just doing the practice will somehow address that thing that you don't clearly know, because it's addressed by knowing what it is.
Yeah, it's good to make that explicit, because even as the sutta says, right, when one sees one of these noble truths, you basically see them all, but there's still an order to these Four Noble Truths. And the Noble Eightfold Path, which is what people generally take to be the practice, is actually the last one. It's the fourth one. So it's not that, oh, I'm practicing the Noble Eightfold Path in order to come and understand those other Noble Truths and find out what craving is and what the cessation of suffering is. No. And until the Four Noble Truths are seen, one basically doesn't know what the practice is, which means that you cannot mechanically settle and continue doing what you think is right, because otherwise you would have seen all those Four Noble Truths already. So rather than accumulating more information or thinking that the Four Noble Truths are the answer to a problem, it's actually more a question of, as you just said, like inquiry and learning how to question and be with the problem, even if it is unpleasant, and basically learning how to not move away from it, because the mental movement away from it will inevitably involve craving for or against the present situation that you find yourself in. And so it's only by learning how to stay with that problem that there will be a possibility of understanding it, and it is through understanding the problem that you can move beyond it, basically.
Yeah.
But if you think this is the problem, and now we need to run around trying to find an answer which I'm going to apply to the problem, which also involves time, then and then you assume that is the Noble Eightfold Path, then that's already completely basically wrong from the outset.
Yeah, it's as others have to say as well, the Dhamma has to be timeless. So it's not like you can just I understand the problem first, and then I do all this, and then the problem is solved. That's a great exemplification of how it's timeless. Like if you see the problem, you already saw the cessation.
That's it. Yeah.
So it's and yeah, as you said, it's so the order of these truths is like, once you have seen the cessation of craving, understood the Four Noble Truths, then you get access to this path, which will help you fully cement that cessation of craving, so that you never go back to it. And that's why it says the suttas define like the stream enterer, and then the Buddha defines what is that stream, and it says it's the Noble Eightfold Path.
Yes.
So that's the stream that they enter, and then on account of having understood what the cessation already is, they're able to practice this path such that while they're walking that path, craving is not there. And then if they keep walking that path, keep developing those factors, then craving will never come back. So it's not a time-bound thing, like the craving is 90%, and by doing these things I'm decreasing it. It's more like while they are there, walking through that path, craving is not there, but that's why it talks about the underlying tendencies. So like during that time that there's right view, right resolve, or right intention, craving is not there, but it can come back. So as a matter of like practicing these things, so to say, for 7 years or 5 years or 6 months, or by sticking to this, then they get to the point where Sotapanna gets to the point where they're so familiar with that cessation of craving that it doesn't come back. Cessation of suffering that it doesn't come back. So that's an important thing to realize, because also craving, we should understand that it's not shouldn't be mistaken for like specific states of anger or aversion or sensuality or desire, because these are more like the results of you not seeing your craving and acting out of it. Then you get these very coarse sort of manifestations. But really, even when your mind is calm and nothing's going on, craving is still there, because craving is really more, you could almost equate it with ignorance. Like craving just means not understanding feelings, means craving is there. So even when it's just a neutral feeling, that nothing's really happening, nothing's really bothering you, the fact that you don't see, that you don't understand, as the Buddha said, the gratification, the danger, and the escape from these feelings, means that there is craving.
Automatically.
Yeah, exactly. So and again, that's timeless. That's a timeless relationship, and so that should be the practice. Like and of course, all of this becomes apparent through the gradual training that comes before, because as you just mentioned, you have to some extent expose yourself to that suffering, but that doesn't mean that you go around doing self-mortification practices like some ascetics in the Buddha's time were doing. You expose yourself to the suffering by just not acting out of your desires. Doesn't mean you need to go the whole way and actually force yourself to experience things you don't want to experience, like sleeping on a bed of nails. It's no, when there's greed, when your mind is greedy, when it's averse, you don't act out of those things, and the right suffering, as we talked about, will be there. And that's your time to start reflecting on these things and trying to understand, without trying to get rid of it, how do I escape this suffering in that timeless way that doesn't require me to go through this process of explaining it, rationalizing it, or sort of psychologizing or doing something to get rid of it. But no, like I directly see in that timeless manner what is the cessation of that suffering. As the Buddha said, the liberation by mind and liberation by wisdom, where those unwholesome states cease without remainder. So that should really be the criteria for like to be seeing from the start, and that's why it's kind of painful, because it's more pleasant to just assume that yes, okay, I got all this right, now I just need to do this practice. But going in that sort of more personal way to like not take anything for granted and keep digging further into your own views, that part is that's why you cannot do it without faith.
Because essentially your personality is inextricably bound up with personality view, so you can't separate them. So if you go and dig deeper, then at some point it is those personality view or views that will come up for question, which experientially means that you bring yourself up for question. Right?
Yeah, and
which is going to be unpleasant.
Yeah, ignorance wants to survive, and obviously if enlightenment were easy, you wouldn't require a Buddha to sort of discover the way out.
Yeah.
They would sort of people would naturally be taking that direction, but as he says, it's always against the grain, because even when you're trying to find a way out of craving, you can easily slip into these attitudes of, like I said before, trying to get rid of things, trying to manage your feelings, even though to you it feels like you are practicing to overcome craving, but actually that's a path of lesser resistance than actually enduring things on the right level, as it's to say, which is the highest asceticism.
Yeah.
That it doesn't say that the highest asceticism is like the person who doesn't sleep, doesn't eat, doesn't breathe, doesn't do anything. It says it's patience or khanti, which is that right endurance.
Yes. Now, can we say that the craving or the desire to change or manipulate things, as you just mentioned, that by definition means that the aggregates are already assumed. Like, if someone would actually see none of these 5 aggregates are mine, then why would there even be the wish to do something about them or to make them otherwise, right? So, but it is because it is not seen, one automatically regards it as having something to do with me, and once that's in place, automatically the question is, what am I going to do about it? Including all the practices, which is going to be by definition wrong. But if somebody would factually see those 5 assumed aggregates that are not self, which is the insight of the noble disciple, then why would he even be bothered with those 5 aggregates, right? And so the whole idea of practices and development in a positive sense, like I'm here, stuck with this, I need to do something in order to get that, which is the whole time-bound approach. And then, because the moment there is that identification, at once the question arises, what is the most effective way, the best practice, the most direct, the highest this, the most superior that, right? And then you get trapped in this whole spiritual circus of everybody offering you the most powerful, secret, esoteric method to deal with your problem. But it's all based on being already identified with those aggregates. If somebody were to actually see that that's not the case, then the whole question of what is the right and the best practice for me undergoes, I'm not saying it fully disappears, but it won't be the same as basically when you start.
Yeah, because as so to say, it's well, anything that's bound with time. The Buddha said, "Why should I seek what's bound with time instead of what's presently or directly available, which is a Dhamma?" And so anything that, even if it's a spiritual practice, but it's bound with that expectation of, I'll do this and then something happens later.
Yeah.
That is essential principle in that sense. Like if it's getting rid of, because sensuality doesn't just have to be just coarse food, music, and that sort of thing. It's just the principle of having pleasure and having pain and replacing it, doing something so that later that pain is replaced with pleasure. But the Dhamma goes the other way around. Like immediately, in that timeless sense, when pain is there, you don't replace it with anything, but you don't suffer either. So that's the sort of paradoxical thing that has to seem paradoxical initially. Like, and the issue with what you said, like that people would make sense of it. Like, sure, if I don't see these aggregates as self, then I won't be craving to do anything about them. But it's also important to see that you start by not fully seeing those 5 aggregates. So you might be able to say, or you might say to yourself, I'm not taking anything as self, but you don't see that actually the 5 aggregates go deeper than that. And you might be taking your action of not taking anything as self, as so to say that's the seeing not self with self in the Majjhima Nikaya.
Yeah, it's not a decision, or it's not a choice or a decision, because if it would be like that, then we can all just decide right here and now, let's not take these aggregates as
well, it can
and
be,
basically you can just decide to become a noble disciple.
It can be a decision for like a Sotapanna or higher, and that's why the Buddha would tell them, okay, now regard form as self, regard feeling as not self.
Yeah, but that's because they fundamentally have already seen that they are not self.
So in other words, it's telling them practice that path, practice that noble eightfold path.
Yeah.
But before that, it's more important to like question yourself with honesty and see, wait, no, I still don't understand what even form, feeling is, because as it said, if I already understood that, which is the first noble truth, I would have already seen the escape. So I wouldn't be like, seeking all these, trying to connect these dots to find the way out. I would see what the way out is just by knowing what form actually is. So just ask yourself, okay, I'm letting go of these things, I'm practicing not self, but do I still have the expectation that, like, okay, so when is the cessation going to happen? That still means you're seeing it in that time, the sense of bound with time. It's not timeless. So that's the thing. Like, the whole thing needs to start with that honest recognition of you being sick, like needing treatment, and then if a patient just sort of they just take the first medicine they take, it just takes the symptoms away, and they assume, okay, that's it, that's enough. Then they won't actually go to the root of their illness. So you can, to some extent, have these release experiences of what you might think is not self, but you have to keep in mind, no, it always goes deeper than this. Like, there has to be more to this, and that's where a lot of people stop. Like, as soon as they're just able to find some way of managing their feelings, because they still on some level assume that to be the problem, then okay, yes, that's the cessation of suffering. So that's why actually the Buddha wouldn't even talk in terms of stream entry or these 4 stages in the beginning. It was more like just cessation of suffering and strive for that, because then it's very easy for someone to find like a way that appears to get rid of the problem, and then they say, okay, well, that's stream entry, so I won't keep that. This is enough for now. I will keep going, and then they can become complacent without actually having reached the actual stream entry. But of course, that will not happen unless you're to some extent already inauthentic or not self-honest enough, because you would realize, no, I am actually liable to craving in some sense. So you only fall into that mistake when you're like actively, when you don't have your priorities straight, basically, when you feel put more importance into like what you are, what supposedly is stream entry or whatever, rather than, no, am I actually liable to suffering or not?
Yeah, I was going to ask just this, like, how can one be sure that one is not just, managing still feelings, but telling oneself, no, I'm a brute in craving, right? Because that's the fundamental difference. Like, management, by definition, also takes time, right? But as you've just explained, the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path is otherwise. So, okay, one can wrap one's head around that, saying time, timeless, no expectations, this and that. That's good. But practically speaking, you sit in your room alone, you're assuming people are keeping their precepts, they've introduced sense restraint into their daily life. Can you just decide to stop managing your feelings and just grind your teeth and then just, right? Because now it's very easy to say, and then just wait for something to happen, which is very already take a wrong turn. So okay, that's wrong, so I don't wait, so I'm not going to manage mine, right? Because this is how it will practically be. So can we go into that? Like, can you decide to not manage your feelings? And is that in fact the same as digging deeper, as you said earlier?
Well, it's all, that's why the Buddha said there has to be these 5 factors for someone to succeed in the practice. And the first one, first of all of them, is faith. So it's kind of that recognition that if you don't have faith, it's more like you just want to do things your way. And the first sort of occasion where you feel that something solved the problem, you will stop there. Whereas if you have faith, you will see, no, I don't, it doesn't matter like if this seems like it works for me, I need to go to the root, to go deeper into the Buddha, what the Buddha actually taught, for example. So without that faith as a foundation, and so actually the other quality the Buddha also said, it's self-honesty, one of the 5 essential qualities. So without that self-honesty, I mean, you can give people various kinds of definitions, but fundamentally they can always sort of find a room or find a space to just stop short of like having overcome 95% of their suffering, but there's still 5% left. And if they have, again, like I said, they don't have their priorities straight, they're sort of more concerned about feeling that they're free from suffering rather than actually being free from suffering, then they might just stop short. And there's even that sutta where the Buddha says, there's the simile of the hardwood, where he says it's like a person looking for hardwood. That's what they want, but they don't know what hardwood looks like. So then the first person sort of just takes like the branches and leaves of the tree, the other one then goes a little bit deeper, the other one goes a bit deeper, and all these things he's talking about virtue, talking about developing samadhi, developing, it says even knowledge and vision, so right understanding. And the Buddha says even that is not actually the hardwood. So then it says like the person would stop there because he would be satisfied with just getting there. So even like insights and stuff and factually getting to understand, not the things that are not in line with the suttas, but actually, getting closer to seeing the five aggregates and such things. Like you stop there, you don't keep going. Then you like it says like he takes the sapwood, which is like right next to the hardwood, and then just leaves with that. And then he says somebody who looks at him would realize, wait, this guy doesn't know what hardwood looks like. So whatever purpose he wanted this hardwood for will not be fulfilled. So that can happen. Like if you don't have that real kind of motivation to just not stop, to not be satisfied. That's what the Buddha would say. Don't be satisfied with wholesome states. Doesn't matter how accomplished you feel. You need to keep going and keep questioning. And actually, even a noble disciple, it's not like they would. It's not like their understanding is perfect, and now they just keep doing the same thing kind of mechanically. It's even an arhat. The sutras would define somebody who fully understands the Four Noble Truths. So in other words, like somebody who has walked, the only person who fully understands the path to the cessation of suffering is the person who has fully walked the path to the cessation of suffering. So even a Sotapanna or any other noble disciple needs to even refine their view of what the practice is even further. Obviously that's like a 0.1% refinement compared to all what they did before. But it's still like even they need that faith, as suttas would say, and would say that if somebody doesn't have faith, like a Sotapanna or a Sakadagami cannot become Anagami if they don't have enough faith to kind of see that, okay, I have this, it's very good and it is factually what the Buddha taught, but I need to still push it further and question it and not take it for granted. And lastly, about the last truth, well, you can even take the example of like a mundane problem. The less clear you are about what a problem is, the more sort of alternative solutions you will feel that there are for that problem. And that's how you sometimes get this view that there are many different paths to the cessation of suffering. Like not in the sense like, how the Buddha would be teaching Anapanasati to some people, other people would be teaching Brahma Viharas. Not in that sense. No, like completely different views about what even craving is, what mindfulness is.
That is basically pre-Sotapatti. So how to actually come to see the Buddha's teaching. That's a very pleasing view, because what works for you might not necessarily work for me. But if you start out by thinking like that is already a compromise of the faith you were just describing, because you would inadvertently be following your own preferences. But if your preferences would be right, then you already wouldn't suffer. So at some point you need to be prepared that you have to go against your own views, which of course then at once raises the difficulty. If that's the case, then how am I going to even find out what's right? Well, you don't know what's right until you know what's right. But practically speaking, that's also not going to be very helpful. But that is actually how you are factually going to come to terms with, for example, the factor of doubt. So doubt can be easily covered up by just settling mechanically for a certain practice, but that's not going to bring any results. So one has little choice but to upgrade one's ideas by listening to those who know what they're talking about, i.e. noble disciples or arahats. And if there's none available, then you have to take recourse from the suttas to find that guidance, right?
Yeah, but what I was specifically meaning was like, that view, you know, there's almost this implication that the more open-minded you are about what the practice is, that's better in and of itself. But if you think about it in the sense of like when you're very open-minded about what the solution to a problem is, that's because you're not clear about what the problem is.
Yes.
So like a doctor, you know, you have two doctors, you know you have a condition, and then you go to this doctor who says, well, you can try this, and if it doesn't work for you, then maybe try this other one, and if not, well, it's all relative, you know. I don't. It's up to you. And then the other one says, no, this is what you need to do, and nothing else is going to work. Now, he might be wrong. Doesn't mean automatically he's going to be right. But if one doctor actually knows what the solution to the problem is, it will be one of the ones who are telling you that it's something very specific. Because that's like, to the extent that you have understood suffering, craving, and the cessation of craving, that narrows down to perfect accuracy what the solution is, what the path is. So because any whether you realize it or not, any practice that deserves to be called different from another one, it will always be because it implies a different view of what craving is. And that often happens with, for example, absorption practices. The sort of, even if it's not stated, the implied view there is that craving is the presence of these objects in my experience. And so then by not having those objects anymore, replacing them with other objects, you assume that you're abandoning craving, but really what you're doing is managing your feelings. And so see, it's not just the fact that you still use the same terminology from the suttas, like craving and Four Noble Truths or whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean that that two people are teaching the same thing, even if they're using that terminology, because they can be pointing at very different things with that designation or that term, craving. For one, it's these thoughts that arise in my mind that I just destroy. And for another one, they might be telling you, no, it's a much more subtle thing. It's an attitude that you have in relation to those things, so then you have to not be too concerned with immediately getting rid of them so that you can actually get to discern that attitude. And so those two practices will not lead you to the same place because they have a different conception of what the goal is.
Yeah. And also, actually, like a lot of these key words are defined in the suttas. That's another thing. It is not just that the Buddha talks about aggregates without ever specifying what they are. Like, you know, people would ask feeling, or stream entry, or consciousness, and then there comes some definition. That can still, of course, be misinterpreted because, as you said, everything is an interpretation. But there can also be a tendency to not define things, which then helps to keep everything open, so that you can get some sort of quasi-justification for your own practice. But if somebody then says, well, actually in the suttas it's defined this way, if you would just stick to that, then half of what you might think the practice is already denied just by upgrading your understanding of what these words actually designate.
Yeah, if you put that first, that would already make a big, like it will narrow down.
Yeah.
You will still have to do some work for yourself to clarify, but it will significantly narrow down a lot of things. But even then, you like I've been repeating a few times already, like you make that practice out of upgrading your understanding of what these terms even mean. Like when I say craving, what is that in my experience? And the problem is most of the time the practice is assumed to be in an opposite direction. Like I just read something about craving is any sort of nebulous ideas I might have about it. That's okay. Now let me do the method, the practice, and then you don't see that all of that practice that you're doing for a goal, that for something that you assume to be the goal, which might not be the same goal that the Buddha was referring to.
Well, the thing is that if you practice for a certain goal, that means that you know the goal, so you're actually already there. So you were saying the other day, like you start from actually there, because there is no point in like thinking like, oh, but I know what the escape of suffering is, but I'm not there yet. No, you're actually already there. So that's where you start.
Yeah.
Then you need to upgrade that because otherwise you don't go anywhere. But
Yeah. You're like I said, you might get new experiences out of like cultivating that understanding, but your overall view remains the same. You haven't upgraded your understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And as I said, even for Sotapanna, like he needs to do that. Let alone somebody who doesn't see the Four Noble Truths and they just keep that definition over just 10 years of the practice and they just accumulate these insights and experiences, but like all secondary to that overall view that they had that, for example, that craving is just these thoughts that they get rid of through focusing or absorption.
Or that there's something outside of that craving that can be applied as an antidote, whereas actually it is the full understanding of craving that equals its cessation.
Yeah, that you can antidote it with something else, failing to see that all of that what you're doing is within craving.
Yeah.
Because then the definition of what craving is like I said before, it's imprecise. And that's when the definition of the problem is imprecise, that's when then you get this sort of just total mix of random practices that you do. I do this one when it works, then when it doesn't work, I do the other one and do the other one. Because again, that imprecise definition of what the problem is, makes it seem like almost anything can like when you're not clear about the fact that your headache is actually caused by brain cancer, you will be thinking that, okay, yeah, maybe a massage sometimes works, sometimes, I don't know, this herbal tea also fixes the headache, and then other times just stress relief and management fixes the headache. Whereas if you see, no, the problem is brain cancer, you would see, wait, there's only one solution to this. Because now you have clarified and narrowed down and pinpointed, no, this is what the problem is.
Yeah. So how is one practically then going to correctly narrow down the problem? This now has to be the next question, right? We've just clarified that we can't just say anything goes as long as you slap the label craving on it. So if the understanding of the craving has to be accurate in order for the practice to be the real practice, how then is one practically going to arrive at this most accurate understanding of what craving is?
Well, to kind of come back to what we were starting this conversation with, the feeling. Would it be safe to say that if you haven't understood the Four Noble Truths, then to some extent you are going to still be thinking that feeling is the problem? So even if you kind of take the view like, yes, craving is the problem, there might still be the
implication.
There's the view kind of under that, which is that oh, I feel bad right now because I was craving. And you're still you're kind of saying, yes, the craving is why I feel bad, but the feeling bad is still where the suffering.
Yeah, in other words,
you're seeing that as the suffering.
You're calling inadvertently. You're calling feelings craving.
Right.
And that's why I mentioned it. Meant with saying yes, you're using the same terminology, but for as long as you don't have the right view, you need to keep in mind, for you, those terms don't mean the same thing as they did, for example, for the Buddha. And then by keeping that in mind, you would never take for granted, because the problem isn't inherently that assuming or confusing feelings with craving. I mean, everybody starts like that, so it's basically inevitable. The real problem is when you don't see the practice being on that level, clarifying that, and just assume, because you can see then, if that remains like a constant, if that's not being questioned, then everything else that happens will be just management of feelings, as successful as it might be, while at the same time believing that you are a rooted craving. And that's really where the problem lies. Because if you were practicing management of feelings knowing that that's what you're doing, then there wouldn't be an issue, because then one day when you really feel like, okay, no, I need to deal with it now, then you would turn to as the Buddha said, to the noble search. But no, it's when you think that you're already doing the noble search on account of management of feelings, even if you don't call it that, that's when it becomes an issue. So it's you would get out of that by, again, through self-honesty. If you have it really established, you would always be able to see that whatever you might be doing on the level of managing feelings will not free you from that liability. Because you can say, yes, even when you have that implication that you just mentioned, like you might not be aware of it, but if you confuse feelings with craving, there will always be that tiny possibility that craving sort of comes by itself, or it will feel like it. And that's actually implied in a lot of times in sort of meditation techniques and stuff. It's like, if I sort of don't catch that mind moment properly, or just something happens that I need to be constantly on watch to prevent it, craving might slip in by accident. And whenever there's that view, there's a misunderstanding between feelings and craving. Because if you saw craving, you would see that there is no way that this can happen by accident. There is no way that this can just come. But where, even if you call it craving, when you have that, like you said, I feel like this because craving is there, and then I get rid of the craving for a moment, and then it comes back on its own, well, that's a sign that you're most likely just dealing with feelings.
Because the feelings come by themselves, and the craving is an answer we give. It's already a reaction towards these feelings.
And it's fully within our responsibility. So that's why then the full cessation of suffering is possible, because if the craving were kind of even like 1% accidental, then it could just come back sometime when you don't expect it, or you get careless or something. But it's because it is like, you can't say it's you're just doing it, because then from the initial point of view, that's not the case.
Yeah, because it does have its momentum already.
Yeah.
So there's a question also of enduring craving, which does arise, but then even then one needs to distinguish that from feeling.
Yeah, so that's why it's more accurate to say that it's more like you're responsible for it. Because if you say you're just doing it, then you might think like, oh, I just stop it. But no, it's like you will be able to stop it at will once you fully see it. But initially you have to keep more in mind like, okay, yes, there is this suffering in my experience and I'm responsible for it, and I need to find the cause. If I just assume that I can like stop it in a finger snap, knowing that I'm not a Sotapanna yet means you probably will be just again engaging in management. So yeah, it is always a result of ignorance. That's why I said you can almost take it as synonymous. Craving and ignorance, basically like synonymous. So in as much as ignorance can be dispelled, as light would just arise in a dark room, as the Sutta would say, craving can be dispelled in the same way. It doesn't take time. So you want to look at it that way and not see it as like, no, okay, I do this sort of metta practice for 5 minutes and then the craving goes.
Yeah, so when you switch on the light, you don't need to wait for the darkness to go away.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right?
That's why.
So the similar principle is now with the craving you're saying.
That's why exactly why the Buddha compared like the arising of knowledge with light arising in darkness.